All right, I think we're ready to start. Welcome to the Robotics Colloquium, everyone. We meet every Friday, most Fridays at around this time. Please do encourage your friends and others to come join us. It's a real pleasure to introduce Henny Admoni. Henny is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, working on human-robot interaction. She got her PhD at Yale and then did a postdoc with me at Carnegie Mellon. Super excited to have that happen. And it was around the same time as Prost, who's also here visiting us. So I was just mentioning to both of them that I am so fortunate to have such amazing students and postdoc and staff with me. Henny's work is really exciting and creative and at the intersection of robotics and humans. It's a piece that's really beloved to me too. I think we need to build robots that can actually go out and help people. And Henny's work actually goes ahead and does that. When we were working together, we spent a whole bunch of time working on assistive technologies and building robots that can work with and around people, how we can think more about shared autonomy and how humans affect the sharing of that autonomy, both algorithmically as well as by running studies. Henny also was one of the early members of the food manipulation project that we had. Back then, we were exclusively picking marshmallows, which were delicious. But then subsequently, Tapo has been leading us to pick other things that are a little more healthy. But they have some projects on that as well. So Henny will be here for the rest of the day. So please do meet with her if you have the chance. And without further ado, Henny.
Thank you. Is this mic? This is good. All right. Thank you for that fantastic introduction, Sid. And it's a pleasure to be back. It's been actually a really exciting visit, and I've seen a lot of old friends and a lot of new friends. So I've really had a good time today. So as Sid mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, and I work in human-robot interaction. And so today I'm going to talk to you about how robots can understand people better to become better collaborators and assistants. So science fiction has given us a vision of robots that are helpful to us, that live in our environment, that speak our language, that can understand our social norms, and that can do everyday tasks with us to help us out in our lives. And I imagine that most of this room is roboticists, and so you all know that we're not quite here yet with robotics. The most effective robots in the world today, the ones that are really out there working effectively, are robots that look more or less like this. These are industrial automation robots. These particular robots are welding cars. But they do the same task over and over again, very precisely, in an environment that's free of humans. And that's important for these robots because humans get in the way. These robots are not designed to understand human behavior or to work together with people. So why do we have a gap, right? Why can we dream about robots that live in our world and help us out and interact with us, and yet the robots that we have today are more or less isolated from people? My work kind of explores that area and tries to understand how we can fill that gap, how we can connect our vision to our reality. And I think part of the gap is because we have yet to understand this part of the equation. So in order to build better human-robot interaction, we really need to understand the humans that are part of that and how the human behavior can give us a sense of what the robot should be doing. And so my work begins with the idea that people have a lot to communicate to us. I try to build computational models of human behavior that understand what's going on with people and how their behavior represents the kinds of needs that they have, and then use those models on robots to adapt the robot behavior to be more responsive to people. So when I say computational models of human behavior, that's a really vague, broad term. So let me give you a particular example of how human behavior can be really, really useful in natural interactions. So I'm going to play you a video. Actually, first, I'm going to play you the audio from this scene. This is a scene of a teacher teaching a student how to play a board game called Transamerica. So it's a 30-second clip, and she's going to explain, this teacher facing the camera is going to explain to her student some of the rules of the game. So first I'll play you just the audio, and I want you to listen and try to see if you can tell what she's talking about. And then I'll show you the full video. And we'll see why human behavior is actually really critical for interaction. So first, the audio.
Are you fine with being like the green player?
Yeah,
Because
green
I'm,
works.
okay,
I like
I'm
green.
yellow.
Okay.
So basically, like these two things, they kind of keep track of your progress across the entire game.
Okay.
All right. So there are a few obvious verbal references that she made that were supported by nonverbal behavior that we didn't see, that are a little hard to understand. So these two things, she referred to a particular piece of the board, and it's a little hard to tell what those two things are when you can't see where she's pointing to. So now let's watch the video and see if you can clarify some of those references.
Are you fine with being like the green player?
Yeah,
Because
green
I'm,
works.
okay,
I like
I'm
green.
yellow.
Okay.
So basically, like these two things, they kind of keep track of your progress across the entire game.
Okay.
Okay, so now that we've seen the video, we know that these two things refers to the two game pieces that are on the board that she actually touches when she uses that reference. But I love this video because it shows another use of nonverbal behavior that wasn't reflected in her speech. So when she says they keep track of your progress across the entire game, she signals to the score line, the part of the board that's keeping score. Her words didn't actually say anything about keeping score or about when the game ends, but her physical behavior gave us additional information that we didn't have just from her speech. Another example is someone could be describing going up a staircase, right? And I'm spiraling my hand. I've never said spiral staircase, but you know that through my gesture, I'm talking about a spiral staircase and not a straight staircase. Human behavior has a lot to teach us about the information that people are trying to communicate. And so when I say computational models of human behavior, what I mean is all of these nonverbal expressive behaviors that give us information about what people are thinking or what people are trying to do. I focus a lot on the top three, particularly on eye gaze. Most of my PhD work was on eye gaze and gestures. But all of these aspects of human behavior are part of the multimodal system that can have robots help robots understand people better. So my work is in the space of nonverbal communication. And I'm interested in that broadly, but a domain area that's particularly relevant to me that I'm very excited about are assistive robotics. And when we talk about assistive robotics, typically we split that into two kinds of assistive robotics. There's physically assistive robots. Those are robots that are physically manipulating the environment, helping people through some kind of physical interaction in the world. And then there are socially assistive robots. And these are robots that are helping people through social interaction, like tutoring or therapy. And I'm going to talk today about one piece of work on the physical side and one piece of really new work on the social side. So I'll start with the physically assistive robot side. So as Sid mentioned, my postdoc work was starting the very early beginnings of the food manipulation project, where we were looking at how we can use shared autonomy to make assistive robots like the one you see in the picture more intelligent and easier for people to use. And we've sort of expanded this out into a whole project on using eye gaze in this domain. So Sid's gone to manipulation and continued the manipulation aspect, and I've continued the human behavior aspect, which are nicely complementary. So these are my CMU collaborators. But I'll present a little bit of history first to kind of ground you in the assistive manipulation work that we did. So in case you're not familiar with it, this work is conducted using a commercial robot arm, like the one you see on this powered wheelchair. This is a Kinova Jaco arm. It's a 6 degree of freedom manipulator. It's designed to help people with severe upper motor impairment do activities of daily living like taking a drink of water or eating a bite of food. Now, these robots are attached to the powered wheelchair. They're connected to the wheelchair battery system, and they use whatever input device the user is already using for their wheelchair. So they're nicely integrated into that system. And these input devices can range from things like a joystick, maybe a 2-axis joystick, to a sip and puff, which is a straw that sits by your mouth and you either blow out or suck in, and that's your entire control signal, or a head array, which is a series of buttons in your headrest, and you can toggle them with your head. So you can very quickly see that these input devices are very low dimensional, right? If you have a severe upper motor impairment, you don't have a ton of upper motor ability to control complicated input devices. And of course, the paradox is that the more you need the robot, because you have more severe impairment, the less physical capability you have to actually control that robot. So we have this dimensionality mismatch. The input devices have small numbers of degrees of freedom, right? Degrees of freedom are directions of input, essentially like dimensions you can toggle. And the robot end effector control is a 6 degree of freedom problem. So this is a repeat for people who are already working with this robot. But if you're trying to control the robot hand, you can control it in 6 degrees. You have X, Y, Z, so you remember your geometry. You also have pitch, yaw, roll. So there are 6 dimensions that you need to control at once. The way people go about using this robot today is through a system called modal control. So this video will be familiar. Essentially, they can control a few degrees of freedom at a time, and they switch through those modes to control the robot fully. So here is an able-bodied user, admittedly, an able-bodied novice, trying to pour a pitcher of water. Essentially, in one mode, 2 dimensions, 2 degrees of freedom are mapped to 2 degrees of freedom on the robot, and then you use a 3rd degree of freedom to explicitly switch modes. And now the joystick is remapped to another 2 degrees of freedom on the robot, and then you switch modes again, and you toggle through this cycle. And you should always, for those of you who are not roboticists, you should always look for the speed up factor on the robot videos. And because this is a slow process, it's really challenging. You do get better with practice, you do get better with expertise. But it's still pretty challenging. The insight of shared autonomy is that we don't need the human operator to fully teleoperate the robot. We can actually add intelligence into the system and make the robot smart, make it try to predict what people are doing, and take some sort of assistive action toward that goal. And so when I joined Sid's lab as a postdoc, they had developed this shared autonomy system for allowing the robot to predict the user's intent based on their joystick input. So the user would use the joystick to control the robot. The robot would use that input to predict a goal that the operator had, and then perform a select an assistive action. And then the system would combine the user input with that assistive action, and the robot would execute an action that was easier for the human than pure teleoperation. And so people's goals are not observable, right? People's goals are hidden, they're secret, they're latent states. And so the system used the observations from the joystick input as observations of the person's goal, and used a POMDP that let us computationally represent uncertainty over those goals. So the robot didn't need to know exactly what goal the person had. It could represent multiple goals at a time and try to assist towards as many goals as possible. This worked. So here's a video to show you that this worked. On the left, you see an operator who's 3 years younger than I am, spearing marshmallows, as Sid said, with the shared autonomy system. And on the right, you see the user teleoperating the same system to do the same task. And as you can see, the system that uses shared autonomy allows the user to have more time to select their particular marshmallow. It uses a lot less user effort. The secret is I don't really love marshmallows. And lest you think this is just a video that worked once and that we shot and never did again, we actually ran a user study in the lab to show that this shared autonomy system was more effective at achieving this kind of food manipulation. And so we compared 4 different levels of assistance. The direct level is the teleoperation. So this is how the robot is sold. It's that modal control I just talked about. We looked at shared autonomy in 2 variants: an older blend policy, or older blend variant, and a newer policy variant. And then we also compared that to just the robot operating autonomously. So the robot picking what bite of food the user got and just doing that food selection directly. So the direct and the autonomous are kind of our control conditions, and we were examining shared autonomy. And we had 23 able-bodied participants come in, and do 5 trials of each of these different conditions. And we measured various factors of their behavior to determine whether shared autonomy was useful. And I'm up here because we found that it was useful. That's why I'm telling you about it. When we look in terms of efficiency, for example, we can ask how often was the user actually successful at picking up, at spearing the marshmallow that they wanted. So when we look at success rate as a function of the different system, we can see that the policy, the shared autonomy version we were comparing, was significantly more successful than either the direct tele-op or the blend control, the older shared autonomy version. We can also see that the task took less time. So when we look at how long it took for people to spear a marshmallow as a function of the assistance strategy, that obviously the autonomous version was the fastest because there was no user input, so that was kind of like the minimum time. But the shared autonomy was close to the autonomous version in terms of speed and significantly faster than the direct tele-op or the blend version of the system. So the efficiency was improved both in terms of success rate and time. We also saw that people had to expend less physical effort. So when we counted how many mode switches people made, we see that the policy version was significantly better than the direct tele-op or the blend. When we look at how much joystick input they had, so we measured the magnitude of the joystick control they had to exert, we again see that the shared autonomy policy improved over direct tele-op and the blend version of shared autonomy. And it wasn't just these physical metrics. We also asked people how they felt about the system. And when we asked them how in control they felt, we asked them to rate how in control they felt on a scale of 1 to 7, we can see that people felt more in control with the shared autonomy method than they did with the fully autonomous robot. So lower numbers are less control, higher numbers are more control. They obviously felt the most in control with the tele-op version because they were controlling every single part. But they kind of felt more in control with the shared autonomy than with the tele-op. And so what we see here is we were enabling people to remain in control. They still felt in control, while at the same time they were performing the task faster and with less physical effort. Okay, so that was exciting. That kind of quantitatively shows that shared autonomy is useful. I started this talk by talking about nonverbal behavior. And so far, I haven't actually gotten to nonverbal behavior yet. This system, as I just described it, entirely works on the joystick input that the user is giving the robot, this direct control signal. But looking at just direct control signal, of course, leaves a lot of information out on the table or out in the world. So people are expressing their goals for this task in a number of different ways that go beyond just the joystick signal. People are using their eye gaze. We can tell from their eye gaze what object they want. We can look at their facial expression. We can look at speech. There's a lot of information that people are exhibiting when they're doing this task. So let me give you an example. This is a video of a user from our study. And in this case, the robot is helping her. This is a shared autonomy condition. So you can see the robot's taking some assistive action, but she's also controlling the robot with the joystick. And you can look at her eye gaze. You can tell where she's looking, what she's focusing on. You can also see a lot of expressivity in her face and her body posture. You don't even need sound to understand what she's feeling in this task. There's a lot of richness to the human signal, the human behavior signal that's going on. The people weren't always successful, so I think she was just really excited to get the marshmallow. So how do we take advantage of this richness of human behavior signal that goes beyond the joystick input? So as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of my work is focused on eye gaze. And let me dive deeply into the idea of eye gaze and why it's useful in this task. So we're particularly focused on eye gaze because where people are looking is very tightly linked to what task they're accomplishing. Psychologists have known this for a number of years, for about 20 years now. So there are a number of older studies, this is one of the canonical ones, that investigated where people were looking and showed that eye gaze precedes hand movement. And you can actually predict where the hands are going to go by looking at where the eyes are. I have to say, I'm really glad that I'm doing eye gaze research in 2019 and not in 2001, because back in 2001, to do eye gaze research, you had people bite on a bite bar, so their head didn't move. You had to keep their head super still. You had to use video cameras above and a mirror system to kind of reflect where the eyes were looking, and then you would draw the gaze fixation back onto the video. It was much more complicated. It's way easier now. You'll see people just wear a pair of eyeglasses that's an eye tracker. But what this research showed us is that people's eye gaze moves ahead of their hands. So here's a video, and this will replay in case you didn't capture it. But you can see that people's eyes will move to the point of fixation before the hand gets there. And as the hand is approaching, the eyes will move to the next point of fixation, either the obstacle or the next grasp point. So the cross here represents where people are looking, and you can see that the gaze is preceding the physical motion. And this is why we wanted to look at eye gaze, because we were thinking that, if eye gaze precedes physical motion, then we can expect that when people are doing this manipulation task, their eyes will tell us what object they want to grasp with the robot, where they're going with the robot. And then the robot can improve its goal prediction and do the task more successfully. And so we recorded people's eye gaze while they were doing this task. We ran this again, looking at eye gaze, and captured an eye tracker view. So this is an egocentric view. This is a user wearing an eye tracker. There's a camera that looks out in the world and cameras that look in at the eyes. And we get an egocentric view with a dot, that red dot, that indicates where people are looking. And our expectation is that that eye gaze dot will reveal to us, before people get the robot there, what target the robot is going toward. That is not really what we found. So this is a video from our study, and you can see that contrary to our expectation, eye gaze mostly dwelled on the end effector of the robot. Now, in retrospect, this is not terribly surprising. We rarely, as humans, look at our own hands, but that's because we have proprioception, we have haptics. We don't need to look at our hands to know where they are. But in this task, people needed to look at the robot end effector to understand the orientation, to understand where it was in physical space. There were a few look-ahead fixations, so people did glance down at the target, but for the most part, eye gaze was at the end effector. We do have some preliminary data. We're building models of this now. So we can predict what target people are going for with about 60% accuracy. Chance here is 30% if you just count the 3 marshmallows equally. And we're trying to improve those accuracy models, but a lot of the eye gaze is actually on the end effector. Yes?
Under what? You had those 4 conditions.
Yeah.
Is this under
Teleop.
manipulation?
Under just teleoperation.
Teleoperation.
Yeah.
Is this when users have no idea that the robot would want to follow their eye gaze to know what they want to pick up?
That's correct. So in this study, the robot was never following their eye gaze. The eye gaze part was just a data collection. So the eye gaze was completely disjoint from what the robot was doing. Yeah, and users, except for one user, everyone else understood that the robot was not actually following their eye gaze. Yeah. So we can tell where people are looking, but we also found something. So we had this unexpected reality, right? That eye gaze with robots doesn't exactly follow eye gaze patterns with our own hands. But we did find something really interesting and pretty exciting. So I'll play this video again from the beginning, and I'll show you the part that I cut off. What we see, so here eye gaze is mostly at the end effector. It occasionally glances down, the eye gaze flicks down to the target. But when people start to have problems with the robot, when they get into trouble, their eye gaze patterns change. So in a minute, this user is going to drop the robot elbow below the hand and get the robot into a kinematic configuration where they can't actually spear the marshmallow anymore. There we go. And they know it, right? The user knows that they're having a problem. It's not actually their fault. They're only doing end effector control. So the robot IK got the robot into this kind of awkward spot. But their eye gaze patterns change. They stop looking at the plate, and they start looking at other parts of the robot, the elbow and the robot shoulder. So what we find is that eye gaze can actually tell us more than just the goal. Eye gaze can tell us when people are having trouble with the task, before they've even expressed to us that they're having trouble with the task. And we see this in a few ways. So here's another example of the kinematic failure that I mentioned. This is a surprisingly common situation with this robot. It's really hard to do end effector control. So here you can see the eye gaze is more or less going between the end effector and the plate until the user realizes that that elbow is too low, and now their gaze patterns change, and they're mostly looking back and forth between the elbow and the end effector as they're trying to get the robot back into a reasonable configuration. We can also tell when the end effector is occluded. So we can see in this video that the user is actually having trouble seeing the end effector. They kind of have to move their head because the robot often gets in the way of the end effector. And the closer you get to the object that you're manipulating, the more the end effector is actually in the way. And so the insight here is we can use this nonverbal behavior to not just tell us what goal people are trying to get to, but also when people actually need the robot to assist. In assistive robotics, you don't want the robot to be assisting blindly all the time. It actually helps to have the robot tone down the autonomy when it's not necessary. Actually, there have been studies that have shown that when people have a choice of how autonomous their shared autonomy robot is, they will actually tune the autonomy down, even though it hinders their performance, because they want to maintain more control. And so we can, right now, we're looking at how do we do this kind of adjustable autonomy based on these eye gaze patterns, based on detecting anomalies in gaze behavior, telling when people are having trouble with the robot, and then assisting with robot autonomy only when it's appropriate, only when people actually need help. I don't have any results to show you on that work. That's upcoming. But I will say that we have open sourced the data from this study. Sid is actually on this paper. So if you go to that website, you can actually find a download link. It's 2 terabytes of data, but we've chopped it up into interesting pieces. We have not just the eye gaze video that I showed you, the egocentric gaze video, but also everything the robot knows, so the robot kinematics. We have a third-person view of people with their pose segmented and their facial action units segmented, and also their eye video and joystick input. So if you want to do interesting things with these data and find interesting insights about human-robot collaboration and co-manipulation, I definitely encourage you to download the data set and email us when you find something cool. Okay, so that was the physical manipulation side, looking at how people's eye gaze can help a robot tell what kind of help people need and when they need help. I'm going to switch over to the socially assistive side, but I want to pause to see if there are any questions on the physical assistive stuff first. Great, and we can also ask questions at the end. So the other half of assistive robotics looks at socially assistive robotics. And so as I mentioned, these are robots that aren't physically manipulating the world. They're embodied, they exist in the world, but they're doing some kind of social interaction. And in particular, the work we're looking at here is examining whether and how robots might be useful for increasing conversational agency for people who use AAC. Now, this is really new work. This is actually the first time I'm talking about this work in public. And I'm pretty excited about it. The project is kind of at the beginning stages, and so I have a lot of preliminary stuff to talk about. Yeah, hopefully you think it's as cool as I do. So this is conversational agency in AAC. One of the most famous AAC users, of course, is Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking had ALS, and he used a device to help him speak. So AAC stands for Alternative and Augmentative Communication Devices. It's a class of devices that help people who can't necessarily rely on vocal speech to communicate. In this case, Stephen Hawking was using a computer and an eye tracker, and he was selecting words on this computer screen. I think he had a switch system. So in the AAC system, you have a person who I'm going to call an augmented communicator, or AC for short, operating an AAC device. And the devices vary, but here's an example of what one might look like. This is an operator who uses a joystick to select letters or words or phrases from her screen and builds up sentences. So she uses a joystick on her wheelchair, and she also uses a button to select the words. And I'm going to play, and then the device speaks out the words out loud. So I'll play you a video of a small segment of her using the device to communicate. This is in a study we did, in a case study looking at how people with AAC devices communicate and whether we can increase their agency. So anyone who's used AAC or seen AAC used knows that this is a really slow process. It takes a long time to form the sentences. And the challenge is that that typing doesn't keep up with the rate of spoken conversation. And so people with AAC often get left behind in spoken conversation and don't get a chance to speak. So in this video, the experimenter, the person running this study, has just asked the AAC user whether they use their device to go online. And we're going to cut in kind of in the middle here.
Instagram.
So this is her dad.
She does everything, but she only uses it like a typewriter. And it's
So you can see
Bluetooth connected
the user's
to
typing.
computer.
She's typing. She's trying to respond to the question.
So this she could use like that, but when your communication device.
Okay, so we're going to speed this up a little bit. Her dad is basically holding the conversational floor. So he is answering the question and giving time for his daughter to type out her answer. And as he does so, there we go.
I can, but I haven't explored the internet.
Okay. So she gets a
She
chance to answer.
can use this. And we do go on the internet for all her updates.
But by the time she finishes typing, the conversation has moved on. He's introduced new topics that the experimenter can ask about. And so it's very common for augmented communicators to not get the chance to speak in these kinds of interactions. So the questions we're trying to explore are twofold. One is what are the factors that actually impact conversational agency when people are using AAC? What are the elements that enable them to speak or hinder them from participating actively in a conversation? And the other factor we're trying to explore is then how do we increase the opportunity for AAC users to speak? And is there a role for social robotics in this domain? So prior work has looked at making the device throughput, increasing device throughput, so making the device easier or faster to use, and also looked at making the device more expressive, because as you can see, it's purely text-based, which loses a lot of the nonverbal expressivity. Our work takes the view that a conversation is inherently a social interaction. And we can actually view the research question 1, the factors that impact agency, we can view them from a social communication lens. So looking at not just the augmented communicator and their abilities with respect to their device, but also the role of their close conversational partner. So usually people who use AACs have a variety of physical challenges. They're usually accompanied by some kind of aid. In this case, it's a parent. It could be a paid aid. And the third party that's engaged in conversation. So we're really interested in these conversations where there's a third party that might not necessarily be close to the AAC, and we're trying to understand how close conversational partners can actually affect the way AAC users engage in conversation. The point here is it's not just about the device. It's not just about throughput. There are a lot of factors that influence AAC agency. The device is definitely one of them, but also the task that they're trying to do. Are they answering yes, no questions, or are they trying to be creative or produce explanations? The relationship constraints. So is the person that they're talking to someone who understands them well? Or is this someone who's not familiar with AAC? And also the conversational constraints. So we have social norms around conversation. Like we tend to follow this linear conversation pattern where the topic will change and we'll follow a new topic. We won't necessarily go back to an old topic. It's like a relevance constraint, that what you talk about should be relevant to the topic at hand, not an older topic, and that's challenging for people who are ACs because often they're typing, by the time they finish typing, the topic has moved on. So we're looking at the conversation from all of these angles. To understand what the potential benefits or what the role of conversational agency is, we ran a case study. We looked at 4 pairs of ACs and their CCPs, so people who use AAC devices and their close communication partner. And people who use AACs, this is a huge heterogeneous group of people, so our ages and genders kind of reflect that. We had younger people and older people. We had people who used a variety of different input devices. Some of them were able to control the AAC device directly, like you would a mouse on a screen. Some of them needed to use a scanning and switch system. You can see with the words per minute how the different abilities and different devices affect how quickly people can communicate. So some people communicated quite slowly at 2.7 words per minute. Some people communicated much faster at about 22 words per minute. And they were also interacting with people of different closeness to them. What we were trying to do is understand what's the role of the close conversational partner, this person, in improving AAC agency. To do that, we looked at a number of different tasks, a number of different conversation tasks. One of the conversation tasks was just a direct question and answer interview. Questions like, how long have you used your AAC device? Do you go online with your device? We also looked at a different kind of communication task. This was a wayfinding task, which has been used in prior research, where the AC has a map with a route drawn on it, this kind of like picture map, and they need to communicate to someone who has a different, potentially incomplete map, what the route is showing, what route to take. And this requires a little bit of spatial description. It requires a little bit of creativity. It's not a direct question and answer kind of interaction. And the third task was even more creative. We asked ACs to produce a collage. So they had to do a craft task where, together with their CCP, who was doing the cutting and pasting, we asked them to produce a collage that illustrated where they wanted to go on vacation. And this is a cool task because it allows ACs to be creative, to come up with kind of artistic ideas rather than directly answering questions. So what we found in all of these tasks, when we analyze for example, the number of AC ideas that made it onto the final craft, or we analyze the number of turns that were, or number of questions that were answered by the CCP versus the AC, we found that CCPs actually do a lot of work to support AC agency and conversation. One of the ways they do this is they balance the participation between the AC and the other people in the conversation. So they might do things like interpreting the nonverbal eye gaze or gestures that the AC is using that are shorthand, like blinking once for yes, twice for no, stuff like that. The close conversational partner might repair misunderstandings. Often the devices will mispronounce words, and the CCP can say, oh, the device meant to say, this other word. And as you saw in the video at the beginning, the CCPs can also hold the conversational floor. So they can basically talk until the AC is ready to contribute. They can also take actions to increase the information exchange. So when the AC gets asked a question, they can answer that question. Sometimes they ask permission to answer that question. Other times they just answer it. So they do it with or without the AC's consent. They can also expand on what the AC has said to provide more detail or more context, so they can add more information to the conversation. The CCP was actually really critical in increasing AC agency, but sometimes these helpful actions actually led to missed opportunities for the AC. So we looked at how often do the ACs have to delete what they're typing. And deleting what you're typing is frustrating because you're putting a lot of effort into typing it, and then you don't get to say it. Sometimes, for example, when the CCP was holding the conversational floor, what they talked about caused the conversation to move on in a way that the AC's speech was no longer relevant, and they deleted what they were talking about. Or when the CCP was answering questions for the AC, they could introduce incorrect information. There were cases where they said things that were wrong, and the AC had to correct them. So now, not only does the AC not get a chance to answer the question, but they have to correct the CCP. Or even when they were right, the responses that they gave essentially reduced the AC to responding yes or no. So they would state something and then look to the AC to confirm or deny, which reduces the amount of contribution the AC provides. So we've published all this in a forthcoming paper. It's under review right now, so hopefully we'll be able to share that soon. Basically, our insight is CCPs do a lot to increase conversational agency. Is there a role for social robots to take on some of that load? So can we use some of those positive behaviors and program them into social robots. This is sort of just an example. I don't necessarily mean we're going to use the Curry robot, but program them into a robot like this to support AC conversation. So the next step in our research is doing a participatory design process. So we actually have one scheduled. We're going to be doing that soon with AC users and movement experts to try to understand what are the CCP strategies that are most effective, most desirable for ACs, and how do we design robots and robot behaviors that can help support AC agency in conversation. So hopefully the next time I come back to Seattle, I'll have more to say about that. Okay, so I kind of gave you a whirlwind tour. In the talk, we talked about robots that are physically assistive that help people eat food, and robots that are socially assistive, ideally that might someday help people maintain conversational agency. In all of this work, I've really tried to emphasize the role of human behavior. The fact that the behavior that the human is exhibiting can inform the robot about what the context of their conversation is, or what their goal is, or when they need assistance from the system. I want to say that obviously none of this work is done alone. I've had really, really fantastic collaborators over time. Here's a somewhat old picture now of the HARP lab at CMU, the Human and Robot Partners Lab, where we do most of this work. And I just want to end with this thought, right? That if we're going to make robots that meet our future vision of these robots that live in our society and help us, the way to actually achieve that is to have the robots understand how human behavior reflects our physical, cognitive, and social needs. Thank you. Happy to take questions. Yeah.
I have questions about the physically.
Sure.
Back to the slide. The physically assistive robots.
Mm-hmm.
You introduced the concept of shared autonomy, and
Yeah.
you compare to different situations. That one used just the direct title operation, and
Mm-hmm.
another with the help of the shared autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
In both situations, the input are just the joystick
That's
input,
right.
right? And can you explain a little bit more how the intelligent system in that block, how it works, like how with the same information, how it can infer
Yeah, sure. So I'll explain a bit at a high level. Sure.
Maybe you could repeat the question. So we get
Sure, yeah, thanks. Good point, Richard. So the question was, in the physically assistive system, the user is giving input with the joystick, and can I explain a little bit more about how the intelligent system works? So the way the system works is you have this continuous joystick input, and that is used, that is input into the POMDP to provide a belief over the goal. So the system knows the location of the food particles of the marshmallows. So it knows the location of each goal. And essentially each goal in this system is a grasp point above the marshmallow. So the system maintains a belief distribution over these goals, right? So it has a probability for each goal being the actual goal that the user has. And that goal is the latent state in this POMDP, this partially observable Markov decision model. So the observations for the POMDP are user input. With every observation, every time step, you update the belief distribution over the goals. And then based on that belief distribution, the system selects a robot action that maximizes movement towards the goals. And then that action A gets combined with the user input in some intelligent way in order to drive the robot toward the goal, but also combine some amount of the user's teleoperation back into the system. And then that updates, right? So then at the next time step, the user is again providing input, and the POMDP is again predicting the user goal. Welcome. Other questions? Yeah.
So what's the clock cycle, I guess? How much delay do you have in your feedback loop?
This is really fast. I don't remember exactly what the rate is, and I don't know what, maybe Tapo has an insight into the current rate. I don't remember the clock cycle of this, but it's really fast because we're not actually solving the POMDP, which is computationally tractable in this continuous space. We're doing an approximation. But as you can see in the video, I mean, the user input gets directly translated. So this is, the system on the left is using this, this shared autonomy system, and it operates quite quickly. The speed of the robot here is just the speed of movement. It's not the speed of the goal prediction. The goal prediction happens quite fast. I don't want to give a particular rate, but I think it's like 30 or 50 hertz or something like that. Yeah.
Seems like one way to think about it. Immediately that robot starts to head toward the plate
Yeah.
without any action.
Fantastic. That's right. So that's a great observation. And that's because all of the goals are at the plate. They're all kind of down here. And so the robot can make progress towards every goal by orienting the fork in this kind of downward position. And so it does that automatically without actually requiring any user input. And if the user didn't give any input at that point at all, the robot would kind of hover in the middle of those three pieces and wait for additional user input to resolve that goal uncertainty. Exactly.
So far in these scenarios, for like very good reasons, it's been, you know, let's spear some marshmallows.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, it's a very constrained task. I'm curious, you know, it seems to me that one of the keystones of like this kind of work moving forward would be the ability to handle like a library of tasks.
Yes.
And there's a huge issue of like selecting the most likely task, the larger that collection of
Yes.
potential goals is.
Fantastic. Yes.
I'm curious if you can speak to that.
Yes. So that is totally work we're working on right now. That's a great observation. So the question, and I should repeat the question. The question is, this task is, you know, singular. There's a single goal, which is spearing the marshmallow, but it seems like the future of the system is having a library of tasks, and the more tasks you have, the harder it is to figure out how the robot should assist completely. So what we're looking at actually is trying to use eye gaze to understand when people have switched tasks and what tasks they've switched to. So imagine that you are putting together a meal, right? You might have multiple containers of ingredients, and you need to take each container out of the cabinet, open it up, and scoop out the contents. And so you can do this, let's say you have 3 containers. You could do this by taking all the containers out first, and then opening all the lids, and then scooping every object, or you can do it by operating on just one container, taking it out of the cabinet, opening the lid, scooping the object, scooping the contents, and then doing it again for the second and third containers. So you have this partially ordered task. What we're trying to understand is, how does eye gaze reveal when someone has switched to the next task and what task they're trying to do? So we've collected some data of people teleoperating this robot in that kind of multi-step task. And we've seen some evidence that eyes are predictive of the next task. So as people are completing their current task, their eyes are actually flicking ahead to the position of the next task that they're trying to do, the next object they're trying to manipulate. And so we're trying to train a system that can use that predictive eye gaze to switch the switch the assistance policy. So the robot goes from, for example, assisting in scooping to assisting in opening. But yes, you have to do that. You have to understand that. And I think Maru is working on interfaces to explicitly do that kind of switch. So this is definitely kind of future work that a lot of people are thinking about. Hiya.
When you have the fully autonomous alternative, it seemed the advantage was that you still had control. I wonder if there's sort of an additional advantage. So autonomy, basically, we know it doesn't work all the time.
Right.
Like there are scenarios where it can break.
Yeah.
And I wonder if sort of shared autonomy will still work in those, or is the intelligence required for that shared autonomy also something that's not as universal as like full autonomy?
Right. So the question here is, we know autonomy doesn't always work because we're roboticists. And is there a role for shared autonomy in fixing those mistakes, or is shared autonomy so limited that it can't perform as well as autonomy? So I brought up this graph. If you remember, this is the success rate. So how often people successfully speared and lifted the marshmallow in these different assistive conditions. And you can see that the median for the shared autonomy system and the autonomous system were both at max. People were almost always successful, but there was actually more variance in the autonomous system. And the reason that is because sometimes our computer vision was slightly off, And so our morsel detector, right, the vision system that told us where those pieces of food are, was misjudging the position of the food. And so the robot would go, in the autonomous version, would go to what it thought was the right food point and do a spearing action and hit just a centimeter behind where the marshmallow was, and not be able to spear it. Whereas in the shared autonomy condition, the system was still doing this. There were still the same number of computer vision errors, but people were able to kind of nudge it at the last minute into the right position. And so actually human perception was overcoming the flaws of autonomy. So I absolutely think that there's a role for shared autonomy where the human decision making and the human perception can actually help us overcome some of the issues of purely autonomous robots. Yeah. Yeah.
So it looked like in the video, the camera you were using was an RGBD?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're actually only using the
Compared
D.
to a stereo camera, for instance.
What about a stereo camera? Like how?
Compared to?
Yes. So the question is, how well would a stereo camera have worked instead of an RGBD?
Yeah.
I don't have numbers for you on that. In this case, we were actually only using the depth camera. We used white marshmallows on the plate to really drive home the idea that we weren't trying to use color. We were just looking for little mounds. A stereo camera would have the same issue, I suspect. The challenge was not the depth map. It was actually the calibration between the camera and the hand. So in this case, this is a camera that was developed in Sid's lab. I've seen a much more stable, I think, connector at this point. I think you've moved past this RealSense holder system. I suspect Rosario has something to do with that. And but in this case, the camera wiggles a little bit, and it's not firmly connected. And so that little bit of movement at this height created that offset. So a stereo camera would have had the same issues because it was just the calibration between the camera and the hand. But this is true of all robotic systems out in the real world all the time, right? That they're all kind of imperfectly perceiving the world. Yeah. Oh.
I've already asked some.
Oh, yeah. So this is kind of I'm putting my accessibility researcher hat on.
Great.
Kind of a high-level question. You showed two kinds of research, one with the robot arm and one with the AC. And one really striking difference to me was the robot arm research. The people that your participants did not have any disabilities.
That's right.
And the other one did.
Yes.
So is there a change in your way of thinking now? Or
Right.
Does that already work, or what's going on?
That's a fantastic question. The question is, in the earlier work with the robot arm, or the physically assistive work with the robot arm, all of the videos you see, all of the examples are with people who are able-bodied, who don't have the disability that the arm is designed for. Whereas in the AAC work, we've really gotten into looking at a population of people who would actually benefit from this technology. Totally agree. That's a big shortcoming of this work. We are right now working on a collaboration that would allow us to run the same study with people with motor impairment. So we needed to understand the system. We needed to test the system with able-bodied people first to kind of provide a baseline to show that our algorithms were working with humans in general. And the next step is to bring in people with motor impairment who would actually benefit and look at the end user population that we actually want. So I know that Sid's lab, under Tapo's guidance, has been doing a lot of work with end user populations here at UW. And we're trying to get that started at Carnegie Mellon as well. Yeah.
So kind of in a similar vein, another contrast between the two experiments was we went from something where we said, okay, we're going to do eye tracking and see how users behave with eye tracking. Again, these are like able-bodied people trying to control a robot arm, to a situation where disabled participants are explicitly using eye tracking as a control surface.
Right.
And, and the physical assistive portion with the robot arm ended at a place where he said, like, well, it doesn't seem like they really look where they want to go. And it's like, well, yes, but like you never told them that they could. Like humans can be trained to do this and are very effective at it. And so and then given the sample population, like there's a very fair argument to be made that like, well, maybe these aren't the people, like maybe if you're very able-bodied, you don't, you haven't used your eyes as a control surface before, and that will change your behavior.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if that is seeing any further investigation.
Yeah. So the question is, in the physically assistive system, people weren't looking where they wanted the robot to go. They weren't using the robot as a joystick, or the eyes as a joystick, whereas in the AAC case, some of the users were because they were using eye gaze control systems. So I want to be really clear. The goal of using eye gaze in shared autonomy is not to use the eyes as a remote control. Actually, my dream, let's bring that up. My goal is to allow a user who might operate an arm like this to have a social meal, to have a social conversation during a meal, right? I don't want to trap the eyes into operating just as a remote control. What I'd like to do is add the eye gaze signal into the system as a secondary implicit signal. So they'd still be controlling the robot with the joystick or whatever other input device they're using, but the eyes would improve the goal prediction and also allow us to adapt the autonomy. And in that way, the user could have a meal with someone else, and when they looked at their conversational partner, the robot wouldn't go and stab them in the face, right? Like how do we recognize when eye gaze is social versus when eye gaze is task-based? Is another question that ties into this research. So eye gaze, we use eye gaze for a lot of things, and I think the cool thing, the thing that makes this a hard research problem, is that eye gaze is so multi-purpose and so indirect, and potentially noisy in that classic sense, but it gives us a lot of information, a lot of richness about people's mental states.
Thank you.
All right.